medieval world where fear breeds cruelty, a woman of extraordinary height sits imprisoned in an iron cage, her humanity denied by those who mock and torment her. The crowd calls her monster, demon, abomination, hurling not just insults but stones at the giant widow who weeps silent tears behind bars that cannot contain her dignity. Then comes the moment that changes everything. The unexpected arrival of the king himself, who silences the jeering mob with 4 words that send chills down every spine. I will buy her. Why would a monarch desire this outcast? What secret connection exists between royal blood and this woman the world has rejected? As she's led in chains to the castle, whispers of witchcraft and treachery begin to swirl, but the truth is far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Behind castle walls, a deadly game unfolds as the widow carries a secret that could topple a kingdom, evidence of corruption that reaches the highest levels of power. When those who murdered her husband realize she survived as a witness, the giant woman and the king himself become targets in a conspiracy, where loyalty is currency, and truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. Will her extraordinary difference become her strength or seal her fate? And what happens when a king who's lost his way discovers that the true monster might be wearing a crown? The morning cold made the mist crawl across the cobblestones of the square when the bells summoned everyone to the spectacle. Children abandoned their games, merchants left their stalls unattended, and even the old women hobbling on wooden canes hurried to witness what had become the town's most macabre attraction. Their breaths formed small clouds in the frigid air as they gathered around the center of the square, where a rusted iron cage stood like a monument to human cruelty. Inside was a woman, if one could still call her that, with limbs so long and a frame so towering that she had to hunch over to fit within the confines of her prison. Her wrists, raw and bleeding from the weight of iron shackles, supported a body marked with bruises in various stages of healing, some yellow and fading, others purple and fresh. The villagers called her many things: giant, beast, abomination. But in the whispers that traveled through the crowd, one word was repeated more often than others: widow. A small boy, no more than 7 years old, pointed his dirty finger at her and shouted, "Demon!" The word hung in the air before being absorbed by the collective murmur of agreement. His mother did not correct him, but instead pulled him closer, as if proximity to the caged woman might contaminate him with whatever curse had made her so unnaturally tall. The crowd grew bolder. A farmer tossed a piece of hard bread that bounced off the cage bars before landing at the woman's feet. She didn't move to take it, even though her hollow cheeks and protruding ribs told the story of prolonged hunger. Another villager followed suit, and soon it became a game. Throw bread at the monster, laugh when she doesn't react, cheer when she finally surrenders to hunger and reaches for the filthy scraps with trembling fingers. But there was something deeply disturbing beyond the grotesque scene itself. Behind the woman's eyes, large, dark, and set deep in her gaunt face, silent tears traced clean paths down her dirt-streaked cheeks. They fell without sound, without sob or whimper, as if she had learned that displays of emotion only fueled their entertainment. Those tears, more than anything else about her, suggested that whatever had happened to her body, her humanity remained intact. Women clustered together at the edge of the crowd, their heads bent in fervent whispers. "She must be cursed by the devil himself," one said, crossing herself. "No woman grows to such a height naturally. It's against God's design." Another nodded vigorously. "My husband says she ate children in her village before they caught her. That's why she grew so tall, feasting on innocent flesh." The others gasped appropriately, adding their own embellishments to the tale. Meanwhile, the men had formed their own circle near the tavern entrance. Coins changed hands as bets were placed. 5 silver pieces says she'll die of hunger before the week's end," a blacksmith announced, his voice slurring from morning ale. 10 says the mob will tire of her and stone her to death first, countered a tanner, the stench of his trade following him like a shadow. The air in the square was a noxious blend of odors, the sweat of unwashed bodies pressed too close together, the sharp tang of oxidized iron from the cage, cheap wine spilled carelessly by merchants who had already drunk more than they'd sold. Each person who looked upon the widowed giant carried contempt in their gaze, as if her very existence was an offense they personally suffered, as if she had chosen her condition and deserved every moment of degradation it brought her. A child slipped through the crowd, approaching the cage with the innocent curiosity that adults had long abandoned. Unlike the others, there was no malice in his eyes, only wonder. The giant woman noticed him, and for a brief moment, something like tenderness softened her features. The boy reached a small hand toward the cage, not in accusation, but in greeting. Before their fingers could meet, his mother yanked him back with such force that he tumbled to the ground. "Don't touch it," she shrieked, panic making her voice shrill. "Its curse might spread." The boy began to cry, not from the fall, but from the incomprehensible cruelty of adults. The woman in the cage closed her eyes, as if she could no longer bear to witness the world that had rejected her. But in the midst of the growing chaos, a detail went unnoticed by almost everyone. At the far edges of the square, partially hidden by the shadows of narrow alleyways, the king's soldiers observed the scene in silence. Their red and gold uniforms were deliberately muted by dark cloaks, but anyone looking closely enough would have recognized the royal insignia embroidered on their sleeves. They watched, they listened, and occasionally they exchanged meaningful glances. Just as the commotion seemed to reach its peak, with children throwing stones that bounced harmlessly off the thick bars but struck the woman inside, with men arguing over how much longer she would survive, with women praying loudly for protection against her evil influence, a trumpet blast cut through the noise. The sound was so unexpected, so official, that it silenced the crowd instantly. The people parted like a sea before Moses as the source of the trumpet call became evident. Riders approached, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. The royal banner fluttered in the cold morning air, announcing an arrival no one had anticipated, the king himself. He rode a midnight black stallion that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the weak winter sunlight. Unlike his gaudy court, the king dressed simply in dark leather and wool, his crown the only indication of his station. He was not an imposing figure physically, of average height and lean build, with a face more scholarly than warrior-like, but power radiated from him nevertheless, evident in the straight line of his shoulders and the unflinching gaze that surveyed his subjects. When he reached the cage, he dismounted with fluid grace. The crowd held its collective breath. No one had expected the king to concern himself with such a spectacle, much less attend it personally. He approached the rusted prison slowly, his eyes never leaving the woman inside. She returned his gaze with unexpected dignity, neither cowering nor challenging, simply acknowledging his presence as one human to another. For what seemed an eternity, they regarded each other in silence. The king's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. Then, without taking his eyes from the woman, he spoke. His voice was quiet, but carried across the now silent square with perfect clarity. "I will buy her." Those 4 words, spoken without emotion or explanation, sent a chill through the bones of everyone present. No one dared question aloud why their ruler, among all people, would show interest in this aberration. But in their eyes, in the sudden tension of their postures, the question was unmistakable. What could a king possibly want with a widowed giant? The sovereign's words hung in the air like an executioner's blade, poised to fall. "I will buy her." 4 simple words that transformed the atmosphere of the square from mockery to stunned disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. The collective breath of hundreds of onlookers suspended in a moment of pure bewilderment. Why would their king, ruler of lands, commander of armies, desire to possess this aberration of nature? Whispers erupted like a disease spreading through the crowd, each person infecting their neighbor with theories more shocking than the last. "Has our king lost his mind?" a merchant's wife hissed behind her hand. "Perhaps it's sorcery," replied an elderly woman, her rheumy eyes narrowing with suspicion. "That creature has bewitched him with a single glance." Others murmured darker thoughts. Is it desire that drives him? The very suggestion sent tremors of disgust rippling through the gathering. The king's advisors exchanged alarmed glances but remained silent, their faces carefully composed into masks of neutrality, despite the panic evident in their twitching fingers and rapid blinking. They knew better than to question their monarch in public, but the tension in their shoulders betrayed their discomfort. One counselor's hand strayed unconsciously to the dagger at his hip, as though preparing to defend against an unseen threat. The smell of wet leather from the king's riding clothes mingled with the stench of dirty straw beneath the cage, creating an oppressive miasma that seemed to thicken the air itself. Rainwater from the previous night's downpour had seeped into the square's cobblestones, leaving puddles that reflected the gray sky and distorted the faces of those who stood above them, transforming ordinary features into grotesque caricatures. A bag of gold coins materialized in the king's gloved hand, its contents jingling with a sound that cut through the silence like a bell tolling at a funeral. He extended it toward the jailer, a rat-faced man whose perpetual sneer had momentarily faltered into an expression of pure confusion. The jailer's Adam's apple bobbed violently as he swallowed, his gaze darting between the bag and his king's impassive face. "Your Majesty," he croaked, voice cracking like dry wood splitting. This thing is dangerous. She has killed men twice her size with her bare hands." The lie tasted sour on his tongue, but fear made him desperate. The giant had never harmed anyone, but the jailer's livelihood depended on the spectacle she provided. Without her, what would draw crowds to pay for a glimpse of the extraordinary? The king's eyes hardened into chips of ice. "Are you refusing your sovereign?" Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension that expanded outward. The jailer's face drained of color so rapidly he appeared to age a decade in seconds. His hand shot out to snatch the payment, fingers trembling so violently that several coins slipped from his grasp and struck the ground with metallic pings that echoed in the unnatural quiet. The key to the cage scraped in the rusted lock, its grating sound unnaturally loud in the hush that had fallen over the square. The hinges protested with an agonized shriek as the door swung open for the first time in what must have been months. The stench that wafted out, unwashed human, festering wounds, and despair given physical form, caused several onlookers to recoil and cover their noses with cloth or hands. The giant woman made no immediate move to exit. Her muscles, atrophied from confinement, tensed visibly beneath her tattered clothing. When she finally attempted to stand upright, something the cage's dimensions had prevented for so long, a soft groan escaped her cracked lips. Her legs shuddered violently, threatening to buckle beneath her. For an instant, vulnerability replaced the stoicism that had been her only defense against the crowd's cruelty. But what happened next astonished all who witnessed it. Despite the pain evident in every line of her body, she straightened her spine with deliberate slowness until she stood at her full, imposing height. Her head nearly touched the square's overhanging banners. Though emaciated to the point where her bones pressed against her skin like knives straining to cut through fabric, she radiated a dignity that seemed incongruous with her ragged appearance. She did not lower her gaze before the king or the crowd that had tormented her. Instead, her eyes, dark wells of experience too profound for most to comprehend, met those who dared look at her with neither hatred nor pleading, but with the quiet acknowledgement of one who has seen beyond the veil of ordinary human concerns. The contrast between her towering figure and the king's modest stature created a tableau so bizarre it seemed lifted from a fevered hallucination. He barely reached her waist, yet power dynamics were unmistakable. He in his clean attire and unblemished skin, she in filthy rags with wounds both fresh and scarred. Yet something in her bearing suggested that chains could bind her body but not her spirit, an impression that unsettled the onlookers more than her physical abnormality ever had. "Secure her," the king commanded his guards, his voice betraying nothing of his thoughts. "Bring her to the castle." The soldiers hesitated, fear momentarily overriding their training. One guard, younger than the rest, with a face still unmarked by battle, crossed himself furtively before approaching. The chains they brought were thick enough to restrain a bull, their weight causing the woman's shoulders to sag when they were secured around her wrists and ankles. The clanking of metal against metal created a rhythmic soundtrack to this strange procession as it formed, with the king mounted on his stallion at the front and the giant woman surrounded by a nervous circle of guards. As they began their march toward the castle that loomed on the hill above the town, The giant's gaze swept across the crowd one final time. Her eyes paused on a small, hunched figure at the edge of the square. An orphan boy with dirt-streaked cheeks and clothing more whole than fabric. Unlike the others, he looked at her without fear or disgust. Only a quiet curiosity tinged with something that might have been recognition of a kindred spirit. The boy darted forward suddenly, slipping through the forest of adult legs with the practiced ease of one accustomed to making himself invisible when necessary. In his grimy hand was clutched a small piece of bread, not a stale crust like those thrown into her cage as mockery, but a portion of what was likely his only meal of the day. He extended it toward her, his expression solemn beyond his years. The giant woman's face transformed. The hardness that had been her armor melted away, replaced by a smile so gentle and genuine that those who witnessed it felt a discomforting twinge in their chests, as though confronted with evidence that contradicted everything they had chosen to believe about her. She could not reach for the bread with her chained hands, but she inclined her head in a gesture of profound gratitude that contained more humanity than the entire town had shown her during her captivity. The king, who had begun to ride ahead, turned in his saddle at the delay. His gaze fell upon the interaction between the giant and the orphan, and something flickered across his features, too quick to interpret but unmistakably intense. His brow furrowed slightly, the only crack in his otherwise impenetrable composure. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the woman's face, studying her as one might examine an unfamiliar text written in a half-recognized language. As the procession resumed its journey toward the castle, the question that had initially stunned the crowd into silence now burned in every mind with renewed intensity. What could possibly explain the king's interest in this outcast? Was it mercy, madness, or something far more complex that motivated his actions? And what fate awaited the widow giant behind the stone walls of the royal fortress? The chains dragged across the stone floor like serpents of iron, each scrape sending shivers through the widow's spine that had nothing to do with the castle's pervasive chill. Her bones ached with every step down the spiraling staircase that led deeper into darkness, away from what little warmth the pale sun had offered. The descent seemed endless, each turn revealing another stretch of worn steps disappearing into shadow. The guards' torches cast grotesque dancing silhouettes on the damp walls, transforming the men into monstrous figures with elongated limbs and twisted features, a cruel mockery of her own condition. With each level they descended, the air grew thicker with the unmistakable scent of human misery. The acrid tang of urine mingling with the metallic hint of blood, and the musty odor of bodies denied the dignity of cleanliness. Yet another smell cut through these, the rich aroma of roasting meat wafting from somewhere above, a torturous reminder of meals she hadn't tasted in weeks. Her stomach contracted violently, a spasm so powerful that she stumbled, nearly dragging down the guard beside her when her chains pulled taut. "Watch yourself, beast," the man snarled, his face contorting with disgust, as if her hunger was an offensive act rather than a basic human need. His hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword, knuckles whitening around the grip. The widow noted the tremble in his fingers, not from compassion, but from fear. These men, armed and armored as they were, feared her. The realization brought no satisfaction, only a hollow ache in her chest that had nothing to do with starvation. The guards' laughter echoed off the stone walls as they led her past cells housing other unfortunates. "Look lively, boys," one called out, his voice carrying the brittle edge of false bravado. The king's brought home a new pet, a domesticated beast for the royal collection. More laughter followed, though it died quickly when she turned her gaze upon them. Something in her eyes, not anger or defiance, but a profound weariness that transcended her physical suffering, silenced their mockery more effectively than any threat could have. At last, they reached the dungeon's lowest level, where the cells were larger but no less bleak. A jailer with keys hanging from his belt like strange fruit stepped forward, his face a map of old scars and newer vices. He unlocked a cell door that groaned in protest, as if warning her of the sorrows contained within. One guard shoved her forward with the butt of his spear, careful to maintain distance even in this act of aggression. "The king wants her alive," the jailer muttered, eyeing her with the clinical detachment of one who had long ago divorced himself from the humanity of his charges. So she gets water twice daily, and whatever scraps the kitchens can spare. His gaze lingered on her unusual height, a mixture of repulsion and fascination tightening the skin around his eyes, though it'll take more than normal rations to keep something of that size breathing. The cell door clanged shut behind her with finality, the sound reverberating through her body like a death knell. The guards retreated up the stairs, their torchlight diminishing until darkness claimed all but a thin sliver of illumination from a distant wall sconce. In this near blackness, the widow finally allowed her shoulders to slump, the careful dignity she had maintained before her tormentors crumbling like a wall too long under siege. She sank to her knees on the damp straw that covered the stone floor, the chains pooling around her like metallic blood from an invisible wound. The weight of them seemed suddenly unbearable, not just the physical mass of iron, but the spiritual burden they represented, years of being treated as less than human, a curiosity to be feared and despised, rather than a woman who had once known love and the simple pleasures of an ordinary life. Above her, in the grand hall of the castle, a very different scene unfolded. The king had summoned his closest advisors, men whose lineages and loyalties had been entwined with the crown for generations. They gathered around a massive oak table, their fine clothing and carefully groomed beards in stark contrast to the prisoner below. Goblets of wine gleamed like liquid rubies in the firelight, though most remained untouched, their owners too disturbed by recent events to indulge. "A dangerous caprice, Your Majesty," ventured the oldest counselor, his white beard quivering with the effort of restraint. "The people already whisper that the giant is an ill omen. To bring such a creature within our walls—" He left the sentence unfinished, allowing the implications to hover in the air like poisonous smoke. Another advisor, younger but no less concerned, leaned forward. "The Church will not remain silent on this matter. Father Matthias already suggests that her unnatural stature is evidence of demonic influence." His fingers drummed an anxious rhythm on the table's surface, betraying the calm he attempted to project. "They may demand she be handed over for examination." A third man, with the sharp eyes and calculating demeanor of one who navigated court politics as skillfully as a mariner navigated treacherous waters, spoke more directly. "Your Majesty risks appearing weak. The Commons may see your interest in this aberration as a sign of instability." His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that expanded outward among the gathered men. Throughout these cautious criticisms, the king remained impassive, his fingers steepled before him, eyes focused on some middle distance, as though seeing beyond the opulent hall to something none of his advisors could perceive. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable weight of authority that needed no volume to command attention. "My reasons are my own," he said simply. "The woman remains under royal protection until I decree otherwise." He rose then, a gesture that silenced any further discussion as effectively as a shouted command. The council meeting was, by his will alone, concluded. In the darkness of her cell, unaware of the political machinations taking place above, the widow pressed her forehead against the cool stone wall. The rough surface scratched her skin, a minor discomfort lost among greater pains. Her lips parted, and in the absolute privacy of her confinement, she whispered a name she had not allowed herself to speak in many months. "Alaric?" The name emerged as a sound halfway between prayer and lament. Her throat constricted around it, transforming the simple syllables into an expression of loss so profound that it seemed to physically manifest in the dank air around her. Behind her closed eyelids, she saw his face, not as it had been at the end, contorted in agony and fear, but as it had been in quieter moments, eyes crinkled with laughter, mouth soft with affection, gaze steady with the certainty of their shared future. A future now impossible. Outside her cell, a guard who had lingered behind his companions heard the whispered name. His face split into a cruel grin, revealing teeth stained by cheap wine and neglect. "Did you hear that?" he called to his fellow soldier further down the corridor. "Even monsters can love." He laughed, a sound devoid of any genuine mirth. "Wonder what poor bastard this Alaric was? Probably crushed him when she rolled over in their marriage bed. The second guard's answering chuckle held a note of unease rather than humor. Something about the raw emotion in the prisoner's voice had struck a chord of recognition, a reminder that beneath her extraordinary exterior beat a heart as vulnerable to suffering as any other. He muttered an excuse about checking the upper levels and retreated up the stairs, unwilling to participate further in his companion's mockery. Alone again in her misery, the widow curled her massive frame into the smallest shape possible, as though trying to disappear into herself. Her eyes remained dry. Tears had long ago proven themselves useless luxuries she could ill afford. Instead, she retreated into memory, the only place where chains could not follow, and where, for brief moments, she could reclaim the woman she had been before fate and cruelty had transformed her into a spectacle. But even as she sought refuge in remembrance, a part of her remained vigilant, aware that she now resided within the very heart of power that had once destroyed everything she loved. What game was the king playing? What possible use could a ruler have for someone like her? Unless... A terrible suspicion took root in her mind. What if he knew? What if somehow he had discovered the truth she had guarded so carefully? The secret that, if revealed, could either save her or condemn her to a fate worse than the cage in the town square. She pressed her lips together tightly, a silent promise to herself. No matter what came next, some truths would remain buried deep within her, as secure as if they were locked in a chest and sunk to the bottom of the sea. Who was Alaric? And what connection did this mysterious man have to the widow's current plight? More importantly, what dangerous knowledge might she possess that could threaten the very foundations of the kingdom? These questions echoed in the darkness of her cell, unanswered but increasingly urgent as the night deepened around her. 7 days passed, and the giant woman's presence in the castle became a festering wound in the kingdom's collective consciousness. In taverns reeking of spilled ale and unwashed bodies, men huddled close, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers whenever the subject arose. "The king keeps her for unnatural pleasures," suggested a cooper with missing teeth, his words slurring as he leaned forward, forcing his companions to inhale his putrid breath. They grimaced but leaned closer still, hunger for scandal overriding their disgust. Why else would a man of power desire such a creature? The question hung in the smoke-thick air, unanswered but fertile with terrible possibilities. At the market square, where the widow's cage had stood just days before, women gathered around vegetable stalls, exchanging theories as they examined bruised produce. "My husband's cousin guards the eastern tower," confided a baker's wife, her flour-dusted hands gripping a turnip with unnecessary force. "He swears the king visits her cell each night alone." The other women gasped appropriately, crossing themselves with frightened reverence. "The church must intervene?" insisted an older woman, her face a map of deep-set wrinkles that deepened with her frown. "Such abomination cannot be tolerated within holy walls." Throughout the countryside, the bells of village churches tolled with unusual frequency, as if calling the faithful to stand vigilant against some invisible threat. Priests delivered sermons warning of giants in ancient texts, always harbingers of divine wrath. Children were forbidden from venturing too far from home, lest the giant woman escape and devour them. A new fear had taken root, sprouting tendrils that reached into every corner of ordinary lives. Meanwhile, within the castle walls, reality diverged sharply from these feverish imaginings. The widow had been moved from the dungeon to a sturdy outbuilding near the stables. Still a prison, but one with fresh air and occasional sunlight that slanted through high, narrow windows. More surprising was the fact that her chains had been partially removed, leaving only a single shackle around her ankle, its long tether allowing limited movement within her confined space. Rather than being subjected to the king's depraved attentions, she found herself assigned to manual labor. Her enormous strength made her invaluable for tasks that normally required several men, moving heavy barrels in the storerooms, hoisting massive timbers for repairs to the castle's wooden structures, hauling water from the well to the kitchens. The stable master, initially terrified of her, had discovered her gentle way with the horses and now reluctantly allowed her to assist with the more difficult animals. What began as fearful avoidance among the castle servants evolved, over these 7 days, into something more complex. The head cook, a squat woman with arms strong from kneading bread dough, had watched the giant lift a cauldron that normally required 3 kitchen boys to move. Instead of shying away, she had nodded in gruff appreciation and thereafter ensured that the widow's food portions, while still composed of leftovers, were more substantial than the meager scraps initially provided. A stable boy with a twisted foot had dropped a bucket of oats, spilling them across the dirty straw. Expecting punishment, he had flinched when the giant approached, only to watch in astonishment as she silently knelt and helped him gather every last grain, her massive hands working with surprising delicacy. That night, he left a small carved wooden horse outside her quarters, scampering away before she could see who had left the gift. The widow accepted these small changes in her treatment without comment or visible emotion. She performed her tasks with the same quiet dignity that had marked her behavior in the public cage, neither complaining about her circumstances nor expressing gratitude for the minor improvements. Yet those with observant eyes might have noticed that her shoulders no longer slumped quite so deeply, and occasionally, when she thought herself unobserved, her gaze would lift to the castle's high towers with an expression that contained more calculation than despair. But not all eyes that watched her were kind or merely curious. From shadows and corners, certain members of the court observed her with cold assessment, measuring her potential as either tool or threat in their political machinations. The king's inexplicable interest in this aberration had created a dangerous, unknown variable in the delicate equations of power. Lord Devereux, the king's cousin and heir presumptive should the monarch remain childless, stood at his chamber window overlooking the courtyard, where the giant woman stacked firewood with mechanical efficiency. His narrow face remained impassive, but his fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the stone sill, betraying inner turmoil. "What game is my royal cousin playing?" he murmured to his attendant, a slight man with eyes like a ferret. "First he buys this monstrosity, then sets her to common labor instead of public execution, or at least proper confinement." The attendant cleared his throat softly. "There are whispers, my lord, that she possesses some knowledge. Information that His Majesty seeks." Devereux turned sharply, his silken sleeve catching on the rough stone window edge and tearing with a sound like a gasp. What knowledge could such a creature have that would interest the crown? But even as he asked, his eyes narrowed with sudden speculation. Unless... He fell silent, mental calculations almost visible behind his pale eyes. Far below in the courtyard, unaware of this particular observation, the widow continued her labor. The rhythmic stacking of wood had become almost meditative, allowing her mind to wander down pathways of memory she usually kept blocked. She remembered Alaric's hands, not as large as hers, but strong and calloused from his work as a scribe, ink perpetually staining the creases of his knuckles. How those hands had held hers without fear or disgust, how they had traced the contours of her face in darkness, finding beauty where others saw only monstrosity. The pain of these recollections was both bitter and sweet, like biting into unripe fruit. Her throat constricted around a sob that she refused to release, transforming it instead into a quiet hum, a fragment of a lullaby Alaric had often sung in his clear tenor voice during the quiet evenings of their brief marriage. The melody drifted in the air, drawing the attention of a kitchen maid passing with a basket of vegetables. The girl paused, her face softening with surprise at this unexpected hint of humanity. The widow didn't notice this small audience. Her thoughts had turned from sweet remembrance to darker recollections. The night when everything changed, when shouting had awakened them, when torchlight had flooded their small cottage and unfamiliar men had dragged Alaric away. His desperate cries still echoed in her nightmares, as did the terrible silence that followed. A silence that told her everything even before she found his body the next morning, dumped like refuse at the forest's edge. A splinter pierced her finger, drawing blood and jerking her back to the present. She stared at the bright red droplet with detached fascination. How strange that her body, so different in size, should bleed exactly like any other human's. This simple fact seemed important somehow, though she couldn't articulate why. As dusk approached, casting long shadows across the courtyard, a commotion at the castle gates drew her attention. A messenger arrived, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding, its sides heaving like bellows. The man dismounted with urgent haste, a sealed letter clutched in his gloved hand. Guards escorted him immediately to the king's chambers, bypassing the usual protocols for visitors. Whatever news he carried could not wait. Within hours, whispers of this mysterious message spread through the castle like fire through dry timber. A scullery maid who had been scrubbing pots outside the council chamber reported hearing raised voices, including the king's, a rare occurrence, as the monarch was known for his measured temperament. A guard claimed to have glimpsed the contents of the letter over a counselor's shoulder, symbols of noble houses, and a single blood-red seal. That night, as darkness settled over the kingdom, the widow sat in her small prison, back pressed against the wall, eyes closed but mind alert. Sleep eluded her as she sorted through the fragments of conversation she had overheard throughout the day. Servants rarely guarded their tongues around her, as if her difference somehow rendered her deaf or incapable of understanding. From these careless words, she had pieced together that something significant had happened, something that had the nobles in disarray and the king unusually agitated. More troubling were the repeated mentions of evidence and witnesses in hushed, fearful tones. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the stone walls. Could it be related to the truth she had guarded so carefully? The secret that had cost Alaric his life? As if summoned by her thoughts, a scrap of parchment appeared, sliding under her door with a whispering sound. She stared at it, heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. Moving with a caution born of hard experience, she retrieved the mysterious message, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant but hastily scrawled, and the words were few. "The innocent blood shall not be forgotten." The parchment bore a small symbol in one corner, the same noble crest she had seen on the uniforms of the men who had taken Alaric, the same crest that adorned the king's own seal. The king descended the spiral staircase to the widow's quarters alone, his footsteps echoing against stone walls that wept with dampness. Each step downward seemed to strip away a layer of his royal persona, revealing the man beneath the crown, a man whose face bore the weight of sleepless nights and burdensome knowledge. The torch he carried cast monstrous shadows that danced around him, distorting his silhouette into something larger and more threatening than his actual modest frame. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he wondered if the sound was audible to others, a betrayal of the anxiety he fought to conceal. When he reached her door, he paused. The smell of mildew and stale straw assaulted his nostrils, a sharp contrast to the perfumed chambers he normally inhabited. For a brief, cowardly moment, he considered turning back, sending a guard in his place. But the letter that now lay folded against his chest, tucked beneath his doublet where it burned like a hot coal against his skin, demanded personal attention. With a steadying breath that failed to calm his nerves, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The widow sat in the corner, her massive frame somehow contained within itself, knees drawn up to her chest in a position that made her appear almost childlike despite her size. When she raised her eyes to meet his, the king's step faltered. He had expected fear, perhaps hatred, but the clear intelligence and assessment in her gaze caught him unprepared. This was not the look of a simple aberration of nature or a mindless beast. This was the evaluation of an equal. The silence between them was absolute, the kind that exists in the moment before a thunderclap or an avalanche, a silence pregnant with potential energy. The air smelled of dampness and something else, something indefinable that prickled at the edges of consciousness. Neither spoke, each waiting for the other to break first. A subtle battle of wills conducted without movement or sound. "You had a message delivered to me," the king finally said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the confined space. He withdrew the parchment from inside his clothing, holding it between them like evidence at a trial. "How did you manage this from your cell?" The widow's lips parted slightly, revealing teeth that were surprisingly even and white, a detail that humanized her in a way that unsettled him. "I sent no message," she replied, her voice deeper than most women's, but not unnaturally so, another surprise that disturbed his preconceptions. "Though I received one." The king's hand tightened on the parchment, crinkling its edges. A muscle in his jaw twitched, once, twice, before he controlled it. Impossible, he said, though doubt had already begun to erode his certainty. This bears the royal seal. No one would dare. I saw what you tried to hide, the widow said, each word dropping into the space between them like stones into still water. She did not move from her position, yet somehow seemed to grow larger, more present. I know what happened to the tax collectors in the northern provinces. I know about the ledgers that never reached the royal treasury. The king's heart, already racing, seemed to stutter in his chest. Cold sweat beaded at his temples, trickling down to sting his eyes. The torch in his hand trembled almost imperceptibly, causing the shadows to shiver across the walls like living things. His mind raced through possibilities. How could this outcast, this anomaly who had been caged in the town square, know of matters discussed only in the most private council meetings? "Are you threatening me?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The question hung in the air, heavier than the moisture that beaded on the stone walls. The widow's face remained impassive, though something flickered behind her eyes, a grief so profound it transcended ordinary expression. "I seek no power," she said, "only justice." A bitter laugh escaped the king before he could suppress it. "Justice," he repeated, the word tasting like ashes on his tongue. "What would one such as you know of justice?" "More than you might imagine, your majesty." The widow unfolded her massive frame, rising to her full height with a grace that belied her size. The king fought the instinct to step backward. "My husband was a scribe in the northern province. His name was Alaric." The name struck the king like a physical blow. His complexion, already pale, drained of what little color remained. The torch wavered dangerously in his grip, nearly extinguishing before he steadied it with visible effort. "Alaric," he repeated, the name emerging as barely more than a breath. "Yes." The widow's voice gained strength, fueled by memory and long-suppressed emotion. He copied the true ledgers before they were altered. He knew who was stealing from the crown and starving the people, and for that knowledge he was murdered on the orders of Lord Devereux, your own cousin and most trusted advisor. The accusation hung between them, vibrating with dangerous implications. To accuse a member of the royal family of such treachery was death, immediate and unquestioned. Yet the king made no move to call his guards. Instead, he stood transfixed, his expression shifting through a complex series of emotions too rapid to identify. "I witnessed it all," the widow continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper that forced the king to lean closer despite himself. "They didn't see me. People rarely look up, and I was able to hide among the rafters of our cottage. I heard them speak your cousin's name as they dragged my husband away. I heard them laugh about how easily the king was deceived while his people starved." The muscles in the king's throat worked convulsively as he swallowed. His free hand had drifted unconsciously to the dagger at his belt, fingers curling around the hilt before relaxing, then tightening again in indecision. "You make grave accusations with no proof," he said, but the words lacked conviction. The widow stepped forward, the chain at her ankle scraping against the stone floor with a sound like distant thunder. The king held his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to retreat. When she spoke again, her breath stirred the air between them, carrying the scent of the simple bread that had been her meal. "There is proof," she said. "Alaric hid the original ledgers where they wouldn't be found. He died protecting that secret, protecting you, though you never knew it." A heavy silence descended, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the soft crackle of the torch flame. The king's mind raced, reassessing everything he thought he knew. If what she said was true, it would explain the discrepancies that had troubled him for months. The reports of starvation in provinces that supposedly enjoyed bountiful harvests, the inexplicable shortfalls in the treasury, despite increased taxation. "Why would your husband risk his life for a king he never met?" he asked, voicing the question that troubled him most. A sad smile touched the widow's lips, transforming her face into something beautiful despite its unusual proportions. Alaric believed in the idea of the crown, if not the man who wore it. He believed that a king should serve his people, not prey upon them. The king's heart, which had been racing, now seemed to slow, each beat landing heavily in his chest like a funeral drum. He was divided, torn between the instinct to protect himself and his family from scandal, and a growing, uncomfortable suspicion that he had been a pawn in a game played by those closest to him. "If what you say is true," he said carefully, weighing each word, "where is this evidence now?" The widow's eyes met his, unflinching. "Would you protect it if I told you? Or would it disappear, like so many inconvenient truths, like my husband's life?" The question was a gauntlet thrown at his feet, a challenge to his honor and his courage. The king felt his face flush with shame and anger. Shame that she would doubt him, anger that her doubt was justified. For a long moment he stood paralyzed by indecision, aware that his response would define not just this woman's fate, but perhaps the course of his reign. "I want," he said finally, each word deliberate and heavy with commitment, "the truth, whatever it may cost." Something shifted in the widow's expression, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. She studied him with the intensity of one trying to read a text in fading light, searching for sincerity in the lines of his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, for she nodded once, a gesture both regal and resigned. "Then we have something in common, Your Majesty," she said softly. "But know this, if you pursue this path, there will be those who would see us both dead rather than let the truth come to light. Your cousin has powerful allies, both in court and in the church. They will not surrender their wealth and influence without a fight." The king straightened, something of his royal bearing returning to his posture. "I am still king," he said, with more confidence than he felt. "My word is still law." The widow's expression remained grave. "Laws mean little to those who have already broken them with impunity. Be careful who you trust, Your Majesty. The walls of this castle have ears, and your cousin's spies are everywhere." As if to emphasize her point, a sound came from the corridor outside, the soft scuff of a boot against stone, quickly silenced. The king's head snapped toward the door, his hand automatically drawing his dagger. Had someone been listening? How much had they heard? The moment of trust between king and prisoner fragmented, replaced by immediate, practical concerns. Without another word, the king stepped toward the door, extinguishing his torch in a bucket of water that stood in the corner. Darkness engulfed them, broken only by the thin sliver of light that came from beneath the door. "This conversation never happened," he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the silence of the cell. "For both our sakes." As he slipped out, returning to the world above where crowns and councils awaited, one question burned in his mind with uncomfortable intensity. Was he truly protecting his kingdom by pursuing this dangerous truth, or was he merely salving his own conscience at the expense of stability? And more troubling still, if he chose to act on what he had learned, would he be strong enough to face the consequences? Lord Devereux's chambers reeked of ambition and expensive northern spices. Candlelight flickered across tapestries depicting ancient battles, their once vivid colors now muted by time and wood smoke. In this false twilight, 5 of the king's most trusted advisors huddled around a table of polished oak, their shadows stretching like accusations across the stone floor. None had been summoned by their sovereign. This gathering existed in the shadowed margins of court protocol, unrecorded, unauthorized, treasonous. "The king grows increasingly erratic," Devereux stated, his slender fingers drumming a rhythmic pattern on the table's surface that sent jolts of irritation through the others present. His nails, unnaturally long and meticulously maintained, clicked against the wood like insect legs. This obsession with the giant woman cannot be allowed to continue. The chancellor, a man whose corpulent frame testified to decades of palace comforts, shifted uneasily in his chair. The ancient wood groaned beneath him, a sound uncomfortably similar to human distress. "Perhaps His Majesty simply indulges an eccentric curiosity," he suggested, eyes darting between the faces surrounding him, seeking allies and finding none. Sweat beaded on his upper lip despite the room's chill. "Do not play the fool, Chancellor. It ill suits you." Bishop Malvern's voice sliced through the air, cold as the blade concealed beneath his clerical robes. Unlike the others, he remained standing, the rigidity of his posture a testament to decades of theological certainty. The king has been seen entering her quarters alone. He speaks with her in private. What curiosity requires such secrecy? Devereux's smile never reached his eyes. Indeed. And what information might this abomination be feeding into our sovereign's ear? The question hung in the air, invisible but substantial as a noose. The castle steward, a man who had served 3 generations of royalty, cleared his throat, a sound like parchment tearing. There are whispers among the servants, he admitted reluctantly. The giant speaks of ledgers and missing taxes. She claims her husband was a scribe who uncovered. He trailed off, suddenly conscious of having stepped onto dangerous ground. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Devereux's drumming fingers froze mid-motion, his knuckles whitening as he flattened his palm against the table. Impossible, he breathed, the word forming a small cloud in the suddenly frigid air. All witnesses were eliminated. The 5th man, silent until now, emerged from the shadows in the corner. Captain Reynard of the King's Guard moved with the controlled precision of a predator, his leather armor creaking softly with each step. "Not all, it seems," he said, his voice carrying the gravel of battlefields and command. "The woman claims to have hidden in the rafters. She witnessed everything." A muscle twitched beneath Devereux's left eye, the only sign of disturbance in his otherwise marble countenance. "And you know this how, Captain?" Reynard's hand rested casually on his sword hilt, but the gesture contained nothing casual. "I have men who are loyal to the crown's best interests, not merely to the man who wears it." The implicit threat in his words prickled across the skin of those present like the first warning touch of a blade. "The church offers a solution," Bishop Malvern interjected, his thin lips barely moving as he spoke. "Declare the woman a witch. My priests have already laid the groundwork among the common people. They fear her unnaturalness, her ungodly size. It would require little persuasion for them to believe she has bewitched their king." Chancellor Horvath's breathing quickened, whistling through his nose. "A witchcraft trial? The king would never permit—" "The king need not be consulted," Devereux cut in smoothly. "If we act in his best interest to free him from unnatural influence, the law allows for emergency measures by his council." His eyes gleamed with the cold light of calculation. "Present him with the witch already condemned, already prepared for execution, and frame it as protection of his royal person." The steward stared into his wine goblet as if seeking divination in its depths. "And if he resists? If he commands her release?" An uncomfortable silence descended, heavy with unspoken possibilities. It was Reynard who finally gave voice to the thought that lurked in every mind present. "Then we have confirmation that his judgment is compromised beyond recovery. The kingdom would require stronger intervention." No one misunderstood his meaning. The air in the chamber grew thick with the scent of treason, metallic as freshly spilled blood. "These are dangerous waters," the chancellor whispered, his jowls trembling. "The king still commands significant loyalty." Devereux leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the table like a stain. "Which is why we must act through official channels, with the church's blessing, and present ourselves as loyal subjects protecting both crown and kingdom from malevolent influence." His voice dropped lower, forcing the others to lean in. "Captain, what of the royal guard? Where do their loyalties lie?" Reynard's face remained impassive, a mask perfected through decades of court intrigue. "Most follow orders without question. Some favor Lord Devereux's pragmatic approach to governance. A few remain personally devoted to the king." His mouth twisted slightly. "The latter can be reassigned to distant outposts before we act." Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the leaded glass windows like impatient fingers. Thunder rumbled in the distance, an ominous counterpoint to their plotting. "We must move quickly," Devereux decided, rising from his seat in a fluid motion that belied his years. "Bishop, have your priests intensify their sermons on witchcraft and ungodly creatures. Chancellor, prepare the legal documents for an emergency council action. Captain, ensure that only reliable men guard both the king and the giant. And you," he fixed the steward with a penetrating stare, "arrange for the woman to be moved to the North Tower tomorrow night. Claim it is by royal decree." As the conspirators nodded their agreement, a small sound, so slight it might have been imagination, came from behind the chamber's heavy tapestry. Reynard's hand flew to his sword, the metal singing as it cleared the scabbard. In 2 swift strides he reached the wall hanging and thrust it aside, revealing nothing but cold stone and dancing shadows. "Rats," Devereux said dismissively, though his eyes remained fixed on the spot. "This castle grows more decrepit by the day." But doubt had entered the room like a 6th conspirator, unwelcome yet impossible to dismiss. The men exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly conscious of the multitude of ways their plans could unravel. In the courtyard below, oblivious to the machinations unfolding above, the widow giant continued her assigned labor. The rain soaked through her simple garments, plastering them against her massive frame, but she showed no sign of discomfort. Her movements remained methodical as she transferred heavy barrels from a newly arrived wagon to the storage cellars, performing the work of 3 men without complaint. A young stable boy watched her from the shelter of an overhanging roof, fascination overcoming his initial fear. When she finished the task, he darted forward, offering a rough cloth to dry her face. The gesture, so unexpected, so human, froze her momentarily. Her massive hand hovered above the cloth, trembling slightly before accepting it with a nod of acknowledgement. "They say you're a witch," the boy blurted out, his curiosity overwhelming his caution. "Are you going to curse us all?" Something that might have been amusement flickered across the widow's face. "If I had such power," she replied softly, "would I have allowed myself to be caged like an animal in the town square?" The logic of this silenced the boy briefly, his forehead furrowing with the effort of reconciling conflicting information. "Then why does Father Thomas say you've bewitched the king?" The widow's hand stilled in the act of returning the cloth. A chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes crept along her spine. "The priest claims this?" she asked carefully, keeping her voice neutral despite the alarm bells clanging in her mind. The boy nodded vigorously, rain dripping from his hair. "Says you've cast an unholy spell to cloud his judgment. Says it's why he bought you instead of letting them stone you proper." From the shadows of a nearby archway, a figure emerged. One of the king's personal guards, his uniform marking him as ranked above the common soldiers. He approached with deliberate casualness, but the widow noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from his weapon. "Boy," he called sharply, "your master seeks you in the stables. Be off with you." The child scampered away without protest, leaving the widow alone with the guard. Rain cascaded between them, creating a shimmering curtain that distorted their view of each other. "The king requests your presence," the guard stated, his tone making it clear this was no request at all. "Come." As she followed him across the rain-slicked courtyard, the widow's mind raced. Why would the king summon her now, in full view of the court, when he had taken such pains to keep their previous meeting secret? A knot formed in her stomach, a physical manifestation of growing dread. The guard led her not toward the king's chambers, or even the throne room, but to a small antechamber near the kitchens. The space was warm from nearby ovens, the air heavy with the scent of baking bread and roasting meat. Her empty stomach clenched painfully at the aromas. "Wait here," the guard commanded, closing the door firmly behind him. Alone, the widow took stock of her surroundings. The room contained a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, and no windows, a space designed for private conversations between the head cook and suppliers perhaps, but certainly not for royal audiences. Suspicion bloomed in her chest, spreading tendrils of anxiety through her limbs. The door opened again, but instead of the king, a hooded figure slipped inside. When the hood fell back, the widow found herself facing a young woman dressed in the simple garb of a lady's maid. The girl's eyes widened at the giant's true height, visible now in the enclosed space, but she mastered her surprise quickly. "I serve Lady Eleanor, the king's sister," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "She bids me warn you. There is a plot against both you and the king. The council meets in secret. They plan to declare you a witch and use your influence on the king as evidence of his unfitness to rule." The widow's heart hammered against her ribs. "When?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Tomorrow night. They mean to move you to the North Tower, where the king's authority does not extend directly." The maid's hands twisted anxiously in her apron. "Lady Eleanor says to tell you that her brother visited her at dawn today. He spoke of ledgers and corruption, of your dead husband. She believes in your innocence and his." Before the widow could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. The maid's face drained of color. "I was never here," she breathed, slipping through a servant's entrance hidden behind a tapestry. Seconds later, the main door swung open to reveal Captain Reynard, his expression unreadable. "The king is indisposed," he announced flatly. "You will return to your quarters until further notice." As guards escorted her back across the courtyard, the widow felt the weight of unseen eyes following her progress. High above, from windows glowing with candlelight, shadows moved behind glass, watching, assessing, plotting. The trap was closing around her, around the king who had shown her the first kindness since Alaric's death. But was he strong enough to stand against his own counsel? Or would his moment of compassion doom them both? The question lingered, unanswerable, as rain washed away her footprints behind her. The great hall smelled of sweat, fear, and sweet wine gone slightly sour. Hundreds of candles bathed the cavernous space in golden light that should have been warm, but instead cast knife-edge shadows across tense faces. The nobility had gathered at the king's unexpected summons. Dukes and barons, ladies and knights, their finery a stark contrast to the undercurrent of anxiety that electrified the air. Whispers darted between courtiers like startled birds, abruptly silenced when the massive oak doors swung open. The king entered first, his simple crown catching the light, transforming ordinary gold into something that seemed to burn with its own inner fire. His face betrayed nothing, not fear, not anger, not the bone-deep exhaustion that hollowed his chest. Every eye followed him as he ascended the dais and took his seat on the throne, the wood creaking beneath him like a living thing expressing protest. He did not speak, merely surveyed the assembly with the detached interest of a falconer assessing prey. A collective gasp rippled through the hall when guards led in the widow. No longer in chains, she walked with her head high, though her massive frame remained clad in the coarse garments of a servant. The contrast between her rough appearance and the silks and velvets of the court created an immediate visual discord that set teeth on edge. Lords instinctively stepped back, creating a pathway through their midst. Ladies clutched at pendants and crosses, lips moving in silent prayer. Lord Devereux stood near the front, his face a carefully composed mask of dignified concern. Only the slight whitening of his knuckles as he gripped his ceremonial staff betrayed his inner turmoil. His eyes darted between the king and the giant woman, calculating, assessing, like a gambler watching dice tumble toward an uncertain outcome. "My loyal subjects," the king began, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "I have brought you here to witness testimony that concerns the welfare of this kingdom, your welfare." His gaze swept the assembly, pausing briefly on each of his counselors, lingering a heartbeat longer on his cousin. "For too long I have heard reports of suffering in our northern provinces, starvation despite bountiful harvests, poverty despite increased taxation. Today we shall hear why." Chancellor Horvath's breath caught audibly in his throat, a strangled sound that drew several pairs of eyes. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the hall's chill, trickling down his temples in rivulets that disappeared into his graying beard. His hand strayed unconsciously to his heart, pressing against his chest as if physically restraining the organ's panicked rhythm. The king gestured toward the widow. "This woman has been brought before you not as a curiosity or an abomination, as some would have you believe, but as a witness." His voice remained level, betraying nothing of the turmoil that had preceded this moment. The hurried, whispered conference with his sister. The discovery of guards loyal to Reynard posted outside his chambers. The realization that he walked a knife's edge between justice and destruction. The widow stepped forward. Her size, impressive in the town square, became truly staggering in the confines of the hall. She towered over even the tallest knight, her shadow stretching across the flagstones like spilled ink. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner without effort, deep but unmistakably feminine. "My name," she began, the simple declaration landing with the weight of revelation in a space where she had been denied even this basic humanity, "is Ilara." My husband was Alaric, royal scribe to the northern provinces. Her throat constricted visibly around his name, the first crack in her composure. He discovered discrepancies in the tax ledgers, evidence that someone was stealing from both crown and commons. The assembly's collective breath seemed to halt, the air growing stale and heavy in lungs, suddenly reluctant to exhale. A lady near the back swayed slightly, steadied by her companion's grip on her elbow. The sound of metal against leather whispered through the hall as guards subtly adjusted their weapons. "These are serious accusations," Bishop Malvern called out, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of one accustomed to sermons. "What proof does this woman offer beyond her word? And can such a word be trusted, coming from one whose very existence defies natural law?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembly. The bishop's question had struck a nerve. Fear of the different, the other, the unexplainable. The widow's unusual height suddenly seemed less a physical trait and more a moral failing, evidence of inner corruption to match the outer abnormality. The king raised a hand, silencing the growing murmurs. "The proof," he said quietly, "is here." He motioned to a guard who stepped forward bearing a wooden box. The simple container, unadorned and slightly weathered, seemed inconsequential, yet every eye fixed upon it with the intensity of starving men regarding a feast. "My husband hid the original ledgers," Ilara continued, her gaze never wavering from Devereux's face. "Before they killed him for what he knew, he entrusted their location to me. These documents show clearly who ordered the falsification of records, who pocketed the difference between what was collected and what reached the royal treasury." Devereux stepped forward, his face a study in righteous indignation. "Your Majesty, surely you don't intend to take the word of this aberration over your own blood and counsel? This is clearly a plot to sow discord, perhaps engineered by our enemies abroad." His voice remained steady, reasonable, the voice of a man confident in his position and power. The king's eyes met his cousin's, holding them in a gaze that seemed to peel back layers of pretense like skin from a wound. "Open the box," he commanded the guard. As the lid lifted, parchment gleamed in the candlelight, ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in implication. The chancellor made a small, wounded sound as the king withdrew the first document and began to read aloud. Figures, dates, annotations in a neat scribal hand. Nothing dramatic or theatrical, merely the mundane arithmetic of betrayal, the bookkeeping of treason. "These ledgers," the king continued, "show systematic theft over 3 years. Taxes collected in full but recorded at half their value. Grain requisitioned for the crown but sold for private profit while people starved." His voice remained controlled, but beneath it ran a current of cold fury that sent shivers through the assembly. "And each falsified record bears the same seal of approval, the personal mark of Lord Devereux, my own cousin and trusted advisor." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that exists in the instant after a lightning strike but before the thunder reaches waiting ears. Devereux's face drained of color, leaving his features sharp and bloodless as a corpse. His eyes darted toward Captain Renard, a silent command passing between them. "Lies," Devereux finally hissed, the word escaping through clenched teeth. "Forgeries created by this monster and her traitor husband." "The handwriting can be verified," the king countered, "as can the unique properties of the ink used in the royal treasury. Ink that contains traces of silver, impossible to duplicate outside these walls." Something shifted in Devereux's posture, a subtle relaxation that was somehow more threatening than tension. His lips curved in a smile that never reached his eyes. "Even if these documents were genuine, which I deny, how would that explain your unnatural interest in this woman? The court has witnessed your obsession, your private meetings, the Commons' whisper of enchantment and ungodly influence." The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and insidious. Several courtiers crossed themselves reflexively. The bishop's expression hardened into something that bordered on triumph. "My interest," the king replied, each word precisely measured, "was in justice, in truth, something I now realize has been in short supply in my court." His gaze swept the assembly once more, lingering on each of the conspirators in turn. "I sought to protect this witness until her testimony could be heard publicly, beyond the reach of those who would silence her as they silenced her husband. Ilara stepped forward again, her massive shadow falling across Devereaux like a physical weight. "I watched from the rafters of our cottage," she said, her voice dropping to a register that seemed to vibrate in the bones of all who heard it. "I saw the men who came for Alaric in the night. I heard them speak your name, Lord Devereaux, as they dragged him away. I heard them laugh about how easily they deceived the king while his people starved." Devereaux's hand moved to his sword, a motion so swift it seemed almost unconscious. Guards tensed, metal rasping against scabbards throughout the hall. The king rose from his throne, the movement drawing all eyes back to him. "Seize Lord Devereaux," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority that had been absent in recent months, as if the act of confronting betrayal had restored something essential within him. And his co-conspirators, Captain Reynard, Chancellor Horvath, Bishop Malvern. For one heartbeat, too, nothing happened. The guards looked between their king and their captain, loyalty warring with habit of obedience. Reynard's hand closed around his sword hilt, his eyes cold with calculation. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Would the king's authority prevail, or had the rot spread too deep? Then a side door opened, and Lady Eleanor entered, followed by the royal house guards, men who answered only to the king's blood family, bypassing the regular chain of command. The balance shifted, power flowing back toward the throne like water finding its natural course. "You would take the word of this aberration, over mine?" Devereaux's voice cracked, outrage and fear warring for dominance. "She is nothing. A freak, a monster. She is human," the king interrupted, each word falling like a stone into still water. "More human, it seems, than those I trusted most." He descended from the dais, standing now on the same level as his subjects. "She lost everything. Her husband, her dignity, her freedom, yet still fought for truth, for justice. Not for herself, but for people she has never met, who mocked and tormented her." Ilara's eyes widened slightly at these words, surprise momentarily replacing the stoic mask she had maintained. Something passed between her and the king then. Not the enchantment that had been whispered of in taverns and confessionals, but a simple recognition of shared purpose that transcended the vast differences between them. The guards moved forward, surrounding Devereaux and the other named conspirators. The chancellor surrendered immediately, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The bishop protested loudly, invoking church privilege and divine protection. Reynard and Devereaux exchanged one final glance, a silent communication that sent alarm racing through Ilara's veins. "Your Majesty," she called out, her voice urgent, "beware." But her warning came too late. With movements too swift to track, Reynard drew his blade and lunged, not toward the king as all had expected, but toward Ilara herself. The widow barely managed to step back, the sword slicing through her coarse garment and drawing a line of crimson across her abdomen. "Kill the witch!" Devereaux shouted, pulling a concealed dagger from his sleeve. "She bewitches the king! Save the crown!" Chaos erupted. Loyalties fractured along invisible fault lines as the court divided, those siding with the king and those believing or pretending to believe Devereaux's desperate accusations. Steel flashed in the candlelight, blood spattered across fine silks and polished stone. Ladies screamed, courtiers scrambled for exits. Above it all, Ilara's voice rose in a warning cry as she saw Devereaux break free of his guards and charge toward the king, blade raised for a killing stroke. Would the king survive his cousin's desperate gambit? And what price would Ilara pay for the truth she had guarded so carefully? Time crystallized in the heartbeat between Devereaux's lunge and impact. The king stood frozen, his body betraying him in this crucial moment, muscles locked, lungs seized, mind racing ahead to a death that seemed inevitable. The dagger's blade caught the candlelight, transforming ordinary metal into a streak of liquid fire arcing toward the royal throat. In the king's ears, his heartbeat thundered with deafening clarity, drowning out the screams and chaos of the hall, reducing his world to this single moment of betrayal made manifest. 3 feet away. 2. 1. The king closed his eyes, a reflex born of terror rather than acceptance. The impact never came. Instead, a rush of air swept past him, followed by a sound like a butcher's cleaver striking meat. Wet, decisive, final. The king's eyes snapped open to witness a sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Ilara's massive form interposed between himself and his cousin, the dagger buried to its hilt not in his flesh, but in hers. Devereux's face contorted with thwarted rage, his aristocratic features twisting into something bestial as he tried to wrench the blade free for a second attempt. Before he could succeed, Ilara's enormous hand closed around his throat, lifting him from the ground with a strength that defied reason. His legs kicked uselessly in the air, his fingers clawing at her wrist as his face purpled. "Enough," she whispered. The word meant only for him. No more innocent blood. With deliberate restraint that required more strength than the lifting itself, she set him down and stepped back, leaving him gasping on his knees. Blood soaked the front of her simple garment, spreading outward from the dagger that still protruded from her abdomen. She made no move to remove it, understanding instinctively that doing so might hasten her end. The king's guards swarmed forward, seizing Devereux before he could recover. Reynard, seeing his co-conspirator subdued, attempted to flee toward a side exit, but found his path blocked by Lady Eleanor and her personal guards. The captain's sword clattered to the floor in surrender, the sound oddly anticlimactic amid the dying chaos. As the immediate danger passed, the great hall fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of those who had fought and the soft moans of the wounded. The smell of blood mingled with sweat and fear, creating a miasma that clung to the back of the throat like bitter wine. The king stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Ilara's wound. "You need a physician," he said, his voice rough with emotion he dared not name. Was it gratitude? Guilt? Something more complex that existed in the space between duty and human connection? Ilara shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, despite the pain-etching lines around her eyes. "It's not as bad as it appears," she lied, feeling the warm wetness spreading down her side. "Your Majesty has more pressing concerns." As if to emphasize her point, Devereux began to laugh, a high, unhinged sound that raised the hair on the back of every neck in the hall. "You think this ends with me?" he called out, blood from a cut on his cheek spattering his words. "Fools, the rot runs deeper than you know. The church, the treasury, the army, all have tasted power without accountability. All have grown fat while the commons starved." The bishop blanched at these words, his earlier righteous indignation collapsing into naked fear. The chancellor's legs gave way entirely, requiring guards to hold him upright. Something in their reactions confirmed the truth of Devereux's taunt. This conspiracy extended beyond the men named, reaching into institutions that formed the very backbone of the kingdom. The king's face hardened, years of indecision and malaise burning away in the crucible of this moment. "Take them to the dungeons," he commanded. "All of them. Lady Eleanor, summon those council members not present. Captain Thorne," he addressed the commander of his house guards, "post men you personally trust at every entrance to the castle. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization." As the prisoners were led away, Devereux twisted in his captor's grip to lock eyes with the king one final time. "You'll never be free of me, cousin," he hissed. "Blood calls to blood. We are cut from the same cloth, you and I. Only I had the courage to take what I wanted." The king stepped closer, close enough to smell the wine on his cousin's breath, to see the tiny burst vessels in his eyes from Ilara's grip. "We are nothing alike," he said quietly. "You took from those who had nothing. I protected someone who had lost everything." He turned away, the gesture a dismissal more final than any pronouncement. "Take him away." Ilara watched this exchange with fading focus, the edges of her vision darkening like parchment burning inward from the edges. The pain from her wound had transformed from sharp agony to a strange, spreading numbness that she recognized as dangerous. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to buckle. Pride alone kept her standing. She would not fall before these nobles who had mocked and feared her. She would not give them the satisfaction. The king returned to her side, close enough now to see the pallor beneath her skin, the sweat beading on her forehead despite the hall's chill. Without ceremony, he removed his own cloak and pressed it against her wound, heedless of the blood that stained the royal garment. "I need her taken to the royal physician," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "Now." Guards stepped forward, hesitating at the practical challenge of moving someone of Ilara's size. She solved their dilemma by taking a single step forward before her strength finally failed her. She collapsed to her knees with a sound like a felled tree, the impact sending tremors through the stone floor. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," she murmured, her voice faint but tinged with unexpected humor. "It seems I lack the dignity for a proper exit." The king knelt beside her, oblivious to the shocked murmurs this unprecedented action provoked among the remaining courtiers. "You have more dignity than any soul in this room," he said, pitched for her ears alone. Ilara's eyes, clouded with pain, focused on his face with surprising clarity. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. Why had he believed her? Why had he risked everything? Why had he treated her as human when the world saw only a monster? The king's answer was forestalled by the arrival of the royal physician, a gray-haired man whose professional detachment faltered visibly at the sight of his enormous patient. To his credit, he recovered quickly, kneeling beside her to examine the wound with clinical precision. "The blade missed vital organs," he announced after a tense assessment. "But she's lost much blood. She needs immediate care, clean bandages, and—" He hesitated, mental calculations visible behind his furrowed brow. "Likely 3 times the normal dosage of medicines given her size. Do whatever is necessary," the king commanded. "She is under royal protection." As guards carefully lifted Ilara onto an improvised stretcher, a table hastily cleared of goblets and platters, the king rose to his feet, turning to address the stunned courtiers who remained. "From this day forward," he proclaimed, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall, "no one in this kingdom shall be judged by their appearance or their birth, but by their actions and their character." His gaze swept across faces that registered emotions ranging from shock to skepticism to dawning hope. Today, a woman the world called monster showed more humanity than those born to privilege and power. "From her, I have learned what true nobility looks like." He gestured toward the doors through which Devereux and his co-conspirators had been taken. "And from them, I have learned the price of complacency. No more. The corruption ends now, whatever the cost." In the days that followed, the king proved true to his word. Investigations uncovered corruption extending into every corner of the kingdom. Some conspirators fled, others confessed in exchange for mercy, still others maintained their innocence to the end. Devereux himself refused all food and water in his cell, choosing to die on his own terms rather than face public execution. The bishop was stripped of his office and sent to a remote monastery. The chancellor provided evidence against dozens of others in exchange for exile rather than death. Throughout this upheaval, Ilara recovered slowly in chambers that had been hastily modified to accommodate her size. The king visited daily, sometimes to seek her counsel on matters of justice, sometimes simply to sit in companionable silence with the only person in the castle who wanted nothing from him beyond what he had already given, recognition of her humanity. On the 15th day, after what court chroniclers were already calling the revelation of treachery, the king arrived at Ilara's chambers to find her standing by the window, gazing out at the countryside beyond the castle walls. Her wound had healed enough to allow movement, though she still held herself carefully, favoring her left side. "Your Majesty," she acknowledged, turning to face him. "I've come with a proposition," he said without preamble. "The northern provinces need a new overseer, someone who understands the suffering of the common people, someone incorruptible." He paused, studying her reaction. "I would name you to this position, with full authority to implement reforms as you see fit." Ilara's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of surprise, followed by thoughtful consideration. The king waited, allowing her the dignity of unhurried reflection. "You honor me beyond words," she finally said, "but I must decline." It was the king's turn to register surprise. "May I ask why?" Ilara turned back to the window, her gaze stretching toward the horizon. "For too long, I've been defined by how others see me, as a curiosity, a monster, now potentially as a symbol of your new order." Her voice softened. I need to discover who I am when no one is watching. The king absorbed her words, respect deepening with understanding. What will you do? A smile touched her lips, genuine if tinged with sadness. Leave. Travel. Perhaps find others like me. I cannot be the only one born different. She faced him again. I seek neither power nor position, Your Majesty. Only the freedom to live quietly, on my own terms. The king nodded slowly. Then that is what you shall have. He reached into his doublet, withdrawing a small leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. A modest sum to ease your journey, and a royal decree guaranteeing your safe passage throughout the kingdom. Ilara accepted the gifts with dignified gratitude. And what of you, Your Majesty? Will you find peace after these revelations? The question caught him off guard, piercing the royal persona to reach the man beneath. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure wavered, revealing the weight of disillusionment and betrayal he carried. I will rebuild, he said simply, both the kingdom and my faith in those around me. 3 days later, as dawn painted the eastern sky with fingers of pale gold, Ilara slipped away from the castle. No fanfare marked her departure, no public proclamations or formal farewells. Only the king knew she had gone, having provided a horse specially bred to bear her weight and supplies for her journey. In the weeks and months that followed, stories began to emerge from outlying villages. Tales of a woman of extraordinary height who appeared when help was most needed, who lifted fallen timbers from trapped children, who carried the ill to healers when no cart could navigate flooded roads. She never stayed long, never accepted payment beyond a meal and perhaps a night's shelter. She left no name, only deeds that slowly transformed the kingdom's perception of difference. The king collected these stories like precious gems, each one a confirmation that his judgment had not been flawed. In a kingdom healing from betrayal, her absence proved more powerful than any symbol he could have created by keeping her at court. She had become legend, not as a monster to be feared, but as a reminder that true worth lay beneath the surface, waiting to be recognized by those wise enough to look beyond appearance. And in this way, both found what they sought. She, the freedom to define herself by her own actions. He, the wisdom to recognize that a crown meant nothing without the courage to see clearly, to judge fairly, and to value substance over form. What truly makes someone a monster? Our story reveals that monstrosity lives not in unusual height or physical difference, but in the hearts of those who abuse power and betray trust. The widow's journey from object of ridicule to instrument of justice reminds us that dignity can survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. Would you have maintained your humanity after being caged and mocked? Could you have chosen justice over vengeance when facing those who destroyed everything you loved? The king's transformation teaches us that true leadership begins with humility, the courage to admit when we've been blind to corruption in our own house. His willingness to see the humanity in someone the world rejected ultimately saved both his life and his kingdom. Sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from those we least expect to teach us, if only we have the wisdom to listen. What prejudices might be blinding you to the truth-tellers in your own life? This tale of the giant widow and the king who saw her worth speaks to the outcast in all of us, those parts we hide for fear of judgment or rejection. Remember that your differences might one day be your greatest strength. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own worth. Subscribe to hear more tales that challenge us to look beyond appearances and find the true measure of humanity. The most powerful stories, like the most valuable people, are rarely what they first appear to be.